until 1948, the Olympics. Okay, so on to our next speaker. We have Maverick Honeycutt with his paper, So Rude, So Crude, Charlotte's History with Urban Renewal and the Annihilation of the African-American Community and the Culture of Brooklyn, 1960 to 1970. Maverick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Newton. I first want to thank the UNCC Graduate History Association for ensuring that we were able to go through with this event during these troubling times. As Dr. Newton said, my name is Maverick Honeycutt, and I'm a senior here at UNC Charlotte with minors in the anthropology and the Holocaust, genocide, and human rights programs. This presentation has grown from my 4600 senior thesis paper, which I started on last semester, but my interest in this topic actually began with a trip to the Levine Museum of the New South, and there's an exhibit there named Brooklyn, Once a City Within a City. And Vernon Sawyer, the head of the Redevelopment Commission of Charlotte, described the culture of Brooklyn as so rude and so crude. But was this really the case, or was this another ploy to portray the Brooklyn area as a blighted slum that needed to be eliminated to promote wide expansion? I personally did not know that there was a Brooklyn in Charlotte. Before my visit to the museum, if I heard of Brooklyn, I thought of New York. With my interest in human rights and race studies, I was saddened to learn that Charlotte's white leaders used federal urban renewal projects to destroy multiple African-American communities in Charlotte. In the case of Brooklyn, once the community was cleared, the land was turned into the governmental center. As I started my research, I noticed that there were many works focused on urban renewal itself. Dr. Hanchett's work, Sorting Out the New South City, is critical to understanding the creation and the destruction of different areas in Charlotte. While these many works explore the negative economic and social effects of urban renewal projects, I found that there was little concerning the effect that these projects had on the cultures lost. This led me to focus my paper on the culture that the Brooklyn residents lost due to urban renewal physically destroying their community and displacing the residents throughout different parts of Charlotte. I hope to portray this culture through oral histories and photographs of the Brooklyn community. The theme of this year's conference is diversity, equity, and inclusion in the historical narrative. My paper addresses all of these issues within the story of Brooklyn's destruction. First, the story shows another obstacle that African Americans faced throughout history. Second, while the story of urban renewal has been told, my research allows for the inclusion of Brooklyn's vibrant culture into the historical narrative. And finally, with the work of Restorative Justice, CLT, and other non-government organizations, the remaining residents of Brooklyn and their families finally have a chance to gain equity moving forward. I first want to situate everyone periodically and geographically. Brooklyn was situated in downtown Charlotte, what was known as Second Ward, but this area was well known throughout Charlotte as the Brooklyn community. It is important to note that these self-sustaining African-American communities began as a result of segregation. The rise of Jim Crow laws created a lack of housing, a lack of business opportunities, and a lack of educational opportunities for African-Americans, forcing the creation of communities all their own. This map shows the 4 wards of Charlotte. Brooklyn is the community in the bottom right corner of the map in green. This map was reduced in 1972, but the urban renewal projects in Charlotte began much earlier than that. The Redevelopment Commission began with a federally required blight study in 1958, which concluded that 67% of the buildings were in various states of deterioration, 51% of the buildings lacked adequate provisions for ventilation, light, or air, and a higher than average incidence of tuberculosis and infant mortality is evidence of the health conditions in these areas. This blight study was one of the only requirements for the federal government to provide the city of Charlotte with 2/3 of the funds needed to undertake the clearance of the Brooklyn area. By the time this map was reduced in 1972, the community of Brooklyn was no longer. The city of Charlotte used the land that once housed the Brooklyn community to create the new governmental center and the central jail, which raised the question to me, did the transformation of the Brooklyn area from a residential and business district into a governmental district really provide more capital and tax value for the city? There were 1,600 families living in the Brooklyn area, over 200 Black-owned businesses, more than a dozen churches, and the first high school for African Americans in Charlotte, Second Ward High School. The first, and I believe only library for African Americans was also situated in Brooklyn, the Brevard Street Library. The library was the cornerstone of education in Brooklyn community. Mrs. Allegra Westbrooks was well known throughout the community as the library lady or the book lady. Westbrooks created a mobile book delivery system to ensure children throughout the community had the opportunity to enrich their minds. As you can see from this page of the Charlotte Redevelopment Commission pamphlet titled A Better Charlotte Through Urban Renewal, the main factor to the city of Charlotte to clearing this area was to increase tax valuation and create a vital building program for commercial and civic development. The fact that over 1,600 families would be uprooted from their community was justified by overstating the slum and blighted conditions of the area. Next, I will show you some of the blighted areas of Brooklyn, then some of the nicer homes, the business district, and the entire community coming together during the annual football game against the African American schools of West Charlotte and Second Ward. While looking at these remaining physical memories of Brooklyn, I will present oral histories from former Brooklyn residents to attempt to strengthen my portrayal of the strong, cohesive culture that existed within the Brooklyn community. The culture that I argue was overlooked and destroyed due to the physical destruction and forced displacement of Brooklyn residents. I want to start with this picture of Mayor Stanford Brookshire on a bulldozer, destroying a home in Brooklyn. This picture was published in the Charlotte Observer, proof of how the city was constantly attempting to keep up the narrative of clearing the city of a blighted area. Mayor Brookshire used the destruction of a family's home as an opportunity for a photograph. Brookshire made his opinions of Brooklyn clear any chance he got. Quoted in an interview from 1979, "We had 238 acres of the most disgraceful, slime and disease-ridden slums you can imagine called Brooklyn." Crime was a constant figure in Charlotte's white elite's arguments for the destruction of Brooklyn. Yet another constant in my research was Brooklyn residents recalling how they rarely had keys to their homes, how they felt safe in their community, and everyone shared everything. Examining this contradicting evidence helps paint a picture of the racist tactics used by Charlotte's white elites to justify the destruction of Brooklyn. Former resident Connie Patton believed that Brooklyn was the best place in the world to live. Another former resident, Charles Clyburn, explained the attachment to the Brooklyn community, stating that we didn't want to leave Brooklyn. We wanted to remodel. 90% of the people would have stayed in Brooklyn if we could have. Former residents of Brooklyn admit that there were rundown areas in Brooklyn, but there were also very nice homes that were demolished. The Brooklyn community had African Americans of all economic levels living in close quarters. Doctors, lawyers, principals, reverends, and working class citizens all called Brooklyn home. This row of shotgun houses were not uncommon in the Brooklyn neighborhood. Many residents worked low-paying jobs because sadly that was all that was available to them in the Jim Crow South. It is also important to note that many of these shotgun neighborhoods were facilitated by wealthy white businessmen in Charlotte. Hanchett provides a telling example of this in Sorting Out the New South City, describing a real estate transaction between two of Charlotte's wealthiest businessmen, William Henry Belk and J.H. Little. 27 homes and 22 undeveloped lots were sold for $13,500. On the other hand, the price of a single home in the Charlotte's emerging white suburbs was around $3,000 to $4,000. Nearly 50 homes were sold in the Brooklyn community for the price of 3 to 4 homes in the white suburbs. These, quote, blighted homes were constructed by part of Charlotte's white elites, only to be torn down for not fitting the neat and tidy image that was envisioned for the future of Charlotte. This next picture is a powerful instrument to understanding the justification of destroying the Brooklyn community. Behind the shotgun home is the Mecklenburg County Courthouse. Mayor Brookshire and other members of the Charlotte City Council expressed their distaste of having to drive through the Brooklyn community to get to the current government center. Much of the driving force behind the destruction of Brooklyn was to, quote, clean up the city. I would like for us to move on to the parts of Brooklyn which really raised the question of how this area was so easily labeled a slum. Religion and the churches were key to the life in Brooklyn. As you can see for this long list of churches that were displaced, and many of them were never able to find new homes. The churches brought residents together multiple times a week for fellowship and worship. Churches provided care for the sick. They also provided food for the community. There were over a dozen churches that were forced to close and relocate, and many of the churches were never able to find new homes, further adding to the destruction of Brooklyn's vibrant community and culture. I cannot imagine the weight these churches had on the moral fabric of the Brooklyn community was considered by the Charlotte Redevelopment Commission when they so easily labeled the Brooklyn community as a blight to the city. The many church congregations throughout Brooklyn created what residents described as one collective family. Families in Brooklyn looked after one another. They shared food. If a child was acting up away from home, their parents would know about it before they got back. This fictive kinship strengthened the cohesive culture in Brooklyn, and without the churches to center this kinship around, the one collective family of Brooklyn began to stray apart. A yearly highlight in the Brooklyn community was the parade put on by Reverend Charles Sweet Daddy Grace of the United House of Prayer for All People. Residents old and young lined the streets to get a glimpse of Grace as he would ride through the streets of Brooklyn. Arthur Wallace Sr. recalled how once members of the Friendship Baptist Church received word they would be forced to relocate, the congregation held a 30-day prayer service. I am not sure that any other piece of my research I found shows the vital importance of the Brooklyn community as this 30-day prayer service does. Former residents were all in agreement that the churches were the center for social life in Brooklyn. Without the churches, I do not believe that the vibrant culture in Brooklyn would have ever been facilitated. And without the churches, there was no way the culture could survive. Along with religion and the churches, educational opportunities were vitally important in the Brooklyn community. Second Ward High School was the first high school for African Americans in Charlotte. A segregated school was another injustice due to Jim Crow laws. But as can be seen with the rest of Brooklyn, the school was embraced and nurtured by the entire community. The building for the high school also became home to a college for returning World War II veterans named Carver College. Classes were hosted during the evenings in the basement of the school. Carver College is another example of the resiliency that African Americans displayed throughout history. To take advantage of the GI Bill, which was deservingly earned through their service, a school was created right in the heart of the Brooklyn community. Second Ward was a cornerstone for Black education in the Brooklyn community. Once it was torn down, it created another obstacle for African Americans to gain a fair education in Charlotte. The destruction of the high school also added to the destruction of Brooklyn's culture. Children who had been looking forward to attending the school had to watch it be torn down right in front of their eyes. Former Barbara Steele spoke about Second Ward High School during an interview. She recalled how the teachers really were just like your parents, and it really was just like another home. This next picture is from the annual Queen City Classic football game between the African American high schools of Second Ward High School and West Charlotte High School. To me, the story of the Queen City Classic encapsulates the vibrant, cohesive culture in Brooklyn that I am attempting to portray. It demonstrates how connected the community was. It illustrates how supportive the community was, and it portrays the community was centered around social gatherings. This simple event was able to bring together the entire African American community of Charlotte for a night of friendly competition. The Queen City Classic ended when Second Ward High School was torn down, another example of the loss of a foundational component of Brooklyn's culture. Former resident Bernard Thompson recalled memories of the Queen City Classic games. She said that people looked forward to it. It was more or less a fashion show and a gala event for the whole community. This next picture is the heart of the Brooklyn Business District, which was centered around Brevard Street. Over 200 businesses called Brooklyn home. In this picture alone, one can identify the Queen City Drugstore, the Lincoln Theater, a grill, and many other businesses. The Brooklyn Business District made it possible for Brooklyn residents to never have to leave the comfort of their community. Former residents recalled how everything they needed was right within their community, and there was no need to leave. This self-sustainability of the Brooklyn community only strengthened the cohesive culture that I have been portraying. Residents had pride in the thriving business district because residents had pride in the thriving business districts, and business owners had pride in the fact that they were building a brighter future for their families. When the urban renewal projects destroyed their business and forced owners to relocate, many businesses never reopened. Once again, Brooklyn residents watched as pieces of their community were snatched away from them. I want to give recognition to this wonderful website which houses the oral histories used during my presentation. This website was a product of a graduate project overseen by Dr. Karen Flint of UNC Charlotte. There are over 40 interviews of this website, all pertaining to Brooklyn and surrounding Charlotte communities. These interviews are filled with memories from former residents who miss the community that they once called home. And I implore any of you interested in this topic to listen to some of these voices from the past. With a little research, residents of Charlotte will discover that Charlotte has been built on systemic racism, which has shaped the residential landscape of the city. Through redlining, urban renewal, and lack of affordable housing, Charlotte continues to maintain residential segregation. In August of 2020, Mayor Vi Lyles gave an apology for the historic policies which have quote, impeded the stability, the well-being, and progress of Black residents. Mayor Lyles went further by stating that the current city council is committed to quote, equity, social justice, and our city's role to address our own systemic racism. Establishing a human rights framework which allows for equal economic opportunity has been longed for in many circles. Many others and I provide ourselves in conducting research that allows others to identify the injustices in our societies. But without the real work of Restorative Justice CLT, the Brooklyn Collective, and many others, there would be no real justice and equity for not only former, but also current victims of the many years of blind injustice. For anyone asking themselves what they can do to help prevent these injustices in the future, reach out to these organizations already active around the city and voice your concern. And I promise you will be able to connect and work with like-minded people. A study from 2014 showed that Charlotte was last in upward mobility rates in the nation. This means that a child born in poverty in Charlotte is more likely to stay in poverty than any other large city in the United States. The generational wealth stolen from Brooklyn business owners when they were forced out of their businesses is one cause of this disturbing statistic on Charlotte's wealth distribution. The continuing gentrification of Charlotte through projects like Brooklyn Village are only adding to the residential segregation in Charlotte. This city should not be last in upward mobility, but the wrongs of the past must be addressed and corrected to ensure a more equitable future. During a great conversation I had with former resident Reverend Janet Garner Mullis, she left me with a quote from Dr. King, which has profoundly impacted me, and I would like to leave you with the same quote. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Thank you, everyone.
Great, another gold medal paper. And I also want to comment before we get in the Q&A, the images, that both presenters